Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be a review of this long, big, giant, cool-looking sword from Ronin Katana. Now, it's not a katana. It is a medieval-inspired type sword. They call it the medieval sword number 1, or the war sword number 1, or the Euro sword number 1. It's known by a few names on the Ronin Katana website. Let's take a quick look at that, shall we? Now, this is the website, Ronin Katana. If you go to the home page right here, you will find that there is a link somewhere in this thing, if I can learn to read, that will tell me that there are European swords, medieval long swords, $250 and up. And right around here, you will be able to find this medieval war sword, long sword number 1. Now, this sword retails for $350 on the Ronin Katana website. It also happens to be $350 on the Cult of Athena website. So let's do a quick glance at what this sword is. It says the handle is 8 inches, handle with pommel 10 inches, weight. Now, there's actually a couple things to note. One, I can't really tell what type of steel it is. I don't know how to tell if it's 1075 or not, so I'm going to take for granted that it is. The handle length, the handle with pommel, the guard length, all in all, these are actually pretty accurate measurements. There's some variation between swords, and mine differs slightly. I'll put the specs in the description down below as well as on the screen here. Total overall length 48 inches is what I have. These are all very similar. Weight 3 pounds 9 ounces. I have 3 pounds 10.5 ounces of just the blade itself. Again, there can be some variation with a sword this long as you're grinding on it, but still an inch, basically an ounce and a half is for a sword this long. I don't know how substantial that is, but I personally feel that that is a pretty substantial thing. Being off an ounce and a half, as silly as that might sound, as minor as that might sound, that's a good amount of steel, and it can have some dynamic property changes. In any case, I'm going to be thinking about this sword as a $350 European sword, and so as I'm formulating my opinions, that's something you should keep in mind, that this is a $350 sword, not a $3,000 sword, not a $100 sword. $350 puts it somewhere in the kind of lower middle range of these types of products. Also important to note that this sword is not accompanied alone. It comes with a scabbard that has a belt type harness on it. And so as I formulate and compare it to other market things, I'm going to be comparing it to other swords in that price point that come with a scabbard. Now, other things that I should note before we really get into the meat of this review. Now you know what I'm reviewing, but you should also know a little bit about me, and that is that I am not a representative or expert or really person you should listen to as it relates to historic European martial arts. I don't study them. I have an enthusiasm for European-style swords, but I will admit that I am far from an expert. So take my opinions, which is what you're going to hear in this review, with a grain of salt. That's what they are. They're just my thoughts, my drunken, rambling thoughts. 2, know that Ronin Katana sent me this sword. Ronin Katana has sent me a few swords for the purposes of review over time, and that's what this is. They sent me this sword for the purposes of review. I have a few other products. I bought stuff from them, but I'm not really affiliated other than as a reviewer. They do send me free stuff to review, so I don't know. It's more important that I suppose you know that, so you can take my opinions with a grain of salt even further than you might already because of the whole not expert thing. The last bit is, this is going to be the review portion of this video. Eventually, I will probably destroy this sword and do some really abrasive testing. That's not what I'm going to do this time. This is the quick and dirty review, which is far from quick, but probably kind of dirty. So the thing to note is that I'm not going to be breaking it yet. If you have some suggestions on what you would like to see me further test the sword on, feel free and throw those in the commentary below, but hold your comments and critiques until you actually see me swing it around. Anyway, on with the show. So the first thing that we're going to do is really outline just the aesthetic qualities and the build quality. I will admit as well that this review is going to be pretty lacking in terms of historical context, i.e. what type of typology this sword is. I'm not entirely sure. It's big and cool. Is that an oakshot typology? Then again, I don't know that Ronin was necessarily going for a historical reference as much as what basically Chris, the owner, really likes. So this is not necessarily supposed to be a historical sword, but maybe it is, and I suppose that's something I should acknowledge, is I just don't know what it is or is not in terms of historical accuracy. So I'm going to talk about build quality, aesthetics, what I think about it, and how well it's put together. Those are things that I think I'm prepared to speak to in a semi-intelligent, mildly sober way, and hopefully you find them helpful. So let's talk about the sword. The first thing we can talk about the pommel. Now, I said I don't have a lot of historic reference, and this might be the one thing that I can actually talk about, is it seems like a Type 5 pommel from the oak shot, or at least a stylistic interpretation of it. What I found is that without a glove, it's actually a little cumbersome and bites into me a little bit. The edges are rounded. There's nothing in here that really should really clip or anything like that. But some of these harsh edges, just as I know how to swing it, tend to bite into my hand. Aesthetically, though, the lines are not terribly crisp, and there are some ledges that are kind of sticking out or jutting out just a little bit over where the actual leather portion of the grip begins. Now, the thing to note is that some of these have been rounded, and I can guess what is an attempt to make my hand feel less crappy as I swing it around. And if I was able to successfully not make this jam into my pommel, or maybe if I just knew how to use the sword, it might be less uncomfortable. That said, it's my understanding that many European swords are used in combination with a glove. If I were to put a glove on here, I don't experience the same discomfort that I do swinging it with a bare hand. All in all, though, I like the overall aesthetic choice for the pommel. I think it looks really cool. It looks, well, that's pretty much a subjective thing, but I think it overall looks really cool. How it aids to the overall historical reference to this, I really couldn't say. But I do think as a general aesthetic choice, I think it looks great. My notes here would be that as I look at some of the counterparts from, say, Albion, some of these lines and ridges are smoother, more even. Well, not smoother. They actually look a little crisper, but they tend to follow a more graceful pattern and don't wiggle around ever so slightly. That said, it does the job. It's just that it's not as crisp as some of the competition that costs 4 or 5 times as much. Let's move on to the grip here. The cord is thicker, or at least whatever string they're using to bind it together is thicker. It's wrapped around what is presumably wood underneath here, and then the leather is coated on top in a very tight, snug way where I can kind of make out the cord. It reminds me of a slightly less defined version of what I was able to see in the Albion Svante, and it has this really kind of thick cord wrap, which on my bare hand actually feels very nice. It kind of digs in, it feels comfortable, easy to grip, but has that kind of tacky sensation that lets me feel very connected to the blade. It has a riser here. Now, I've taken some measurements and put them down to let you know approximately where this riser is. I do find it interesting that it has this kind of elegant swelling here that kind of basically gives me a natural footing for my hands to fit in. It's a pretty comfortable blade to grip and feel. As soon as I start swinging it, it jams into my hand a little bit, but at least in my hands generally, it actually feels pretty comfortable. The other bit to note is there is a seam. This is a very soft thing. It doesn't bite into my hands at all. And as I was swinging it around, even in the limited amount that I have so far, which honestly, frankly, isn't that limited, I've swung this at more than a few things. And the grip hasn't come loose. It's in the same condition. It's just as shiny. Nothing, no stains, no issues, no scratches. And the seam hasn't come apart or really given me any trouble as I've been holding it and swinging it around rather haphazardly at times. This does seem a little bit thick. It's obnoxious to grip it here. It feels like if I'm going to use it one-handed, which is not terribly comfortable. I'll elaborate on that later. My hands really only fit in a couple spots, and maybe that's an intentional thing, maybe that's a good thing, I guess I don't really know, but it doesn't give me the same versatility. Here it feels like it wants to jump out of my hands a little bit. My hands naturally seem to fall into these two places, or even not so much gripping the pommel here. It feels very uncomfortable to kind of try to grab the pommel this way. My hand feels much more comfortable here naturally. So grip-wise though, assembly, it's held up really well. It doesn't rattle, it hasn't cracked, and the leather hasn't come undone at all. That was a complaint I had in some earlier version of Ronin Katana's pieces, that the cord might come undone or the gripping would come undone. Some of the prototypes that I still have up on my wall there, the leather was not as well done. So whatever steps they've taken to correct the leather or make it more durable and resilient are kind of showing in this one. It definitely has held up to the punches. The crossguard. So there's a lot to say and not say about this crossguard. One, these little bits and barbs are rather sharp, but I found myself not thumping myself in the head with it. I don't know if it's the weight or just how I'm swinging this sword, but in some swords when they're sharp, I tend to knock myself in the head with them when I go to throw a strike from here. I didn't end up doing that with this one. Maybe I've just learned my lesson, though. For those of you that know me, you would probably find that as unlikely as anything else. So Maybe it's because they're canted upward. I remember pinging myself in the head with the Darksword Armory thing that had some sharp edges on it. I didn't have the same problem with this, though it does give me a little concern. They're pointy enough where if you give yourself a good thump in the head, they're going to cause some discomfort. The other thing is I don't really know what stylistic thing this is. They seem to match a few different things as I look at some of the Oakshott typology pieces that I can find online. A quick jet over to my armory. This shows some of these pieces or some of these styles, and I don't know what to put it in. In some, it kind of curves like this in a style 11, but it has a different general formation, which is maybe closer to this, but maybe kind of the inverse, honestly. It also has, I guess, some similarity to something like this, but it bends upward more, kind of like this, but the points are different. In any respect, I don't know exactly what to call it, and that's where I struggle. What I can tell you, though, is aesthetically it looks very nice, though there are some minor imperfections. For example, here there's this little bubble in the crossguard, which is a minor imperfection from the overall casting. That said, everything else actually looks pretty crisp and clean, though aesthetically to me, I don't think it looks personally as pretty as the Pommel does. I think the Pommel looks good. This looks a little frilly and thin, and it doesn't look as pretty to me as the Pommel does. I personally like to see something a little more robust, though I can understand why you wouldn't necessarily want that. The sword's already heavy enough, and if this does the job, why fix what ain't broke? It looks pretty, it's thin, and probably does the job. In any respect, it's more an aesthetic choice, it's a subjective thing, and given what I've already told you about my knowledge of European history and medieval war swords, is really not a whole lot to go on. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't, but from a subjective aspect, the guard doesn't necessarily do it for me. What kind of does do it for me, though, is in terms of the crossguard, these terminations right here are actually quite good. The gap between the crossguard doesn't have a whole bunch of big, bulky unevenness to it. It could be tighter, it could be cleaner, it could be better, no argument. I can spot some glue, but it's not raised up on the blade. Overall, this transition is one of the best that I've seen in a sword of this price point. Very often at sub $500, this hole in the guard tends to be just all kittywampus and ugly, and here it's looking actually pretty good. It's not bad at all. Could it be better? Is it perfect? No, it's not. It could be better. Certainly, it could be tighter. It could be all the wonderful things. But for $350, this is a much more approachable, better thing. In fact, I don't tend to see things this clean on some custom pieces. It's really a step in the right direction. I think Ronin stepped their game up there. This actually, in my mind, looks pretty good. Not as good as Albion, not as good as some of the really high-end makers, but frankly pretty good. The reverse side is true here. What I like is that on this base right here, the guard doesn't overlap, or the grip doesn't overlap the guard. It fits in pretty even Steven over here, and I like that. It drives me a little crazy when the guard overlaps unintentionally and it's just made too big. The transition here I feel fits pretty well. Also note that the crossguard is even. It's not busted or bent out of shape or anything like that. So aside from the subjective, I don't really like the way it looks, I do have to admit that it fits on there pretty good. They did a good job of fitting it, and it's superior to the other products that I've seen from them, so tip of my hat there. Now before I get on to the part that everybody cares about, it's important to note that these come with a scabbard that has a belt. The belt doesn't have any buckles or anything like that. It does have a chape or a little end piece, I think I'm saying that right. And it's a leather-bound wooden cord scabbard. So for what it is, I mean, the simple fact is it comes with it at $350, which is pretty nice. It's wooden cord. The seam on it is nice, but it doesn't have a whole lot of adornments or risers or special bits in the leather. The leather on the belt is better than some of the quality that I've seen from other Ronin products. I had a zombie killer sword. The leather on that wasn't fantastic. And then some of the other leather work was a little lacking. This is better, passable, it's functional and usable, so I do appreciate that. The scabbard, though, is I don't know, it's missing a few things. At $350, I appreciate that it comes with it. I think, personally, if the sword was just $350, that would not necessarily be bad. Coming with a scabbard is definitely an added bonus, but I do need to note, if you're going to include a scabbard, there's a couple misses here. One, it rattles around. Two, it just kind of falls out. There's really no grippy sensation in the scabbard at all. It's not as loose as some of its competitors. I think back to that 15th century hand and a half sword from Dark Sword Armory that I reviewed, and it had a lot more rattle than this. I have a belt on here, which is making some of the noise, but if I try to hold it down, it still rattles around a little bit, and it doesn't grip on. Though this actually seems like I might be able to shim it in such a way that there's not so much movement, that the grip doesn't rotate, half an inch inside the mouth of the scabbard. So from that standpoint, I think the scabbard is serviceable, though it doesn't do all the things that scabbards should do right now. Still, for $350, pretty top notch. I think about that in comparison to the Dark Sword Armory piece that was almost $500 if it came with a scabbard and belt apparatus. I think the scabbard had more adornments, but this is closer to functional than the Dark Sword Armory piece was for me, at least in the piece I have to compare it to. Anyway, now we can move on to the pointy stabby part, the thing that everyone cares about, the actual blade. Supposedly made out of 1075, as I noted earlier, though no way to really reflect that. There are some things that I suppose I would note. One, it's big. This is larger than some of the other swords that I've tested from Ronin. The edge geometry is pretty good, though in terms of sharpness, it's not as sharp as their katanas are. You'll see in just a moment when I get to the actual testing side of things, but it's not overly super stouty, cumbersome, club-footed, but at the same time, it's not as sharp as it really could be to do really effective cutting on tatami or some of the things that require or really showcase what a sharp edge can do. However, in terms of geometry, I don't know exactly what typology you would call this. Cool typology? I'm not sure. It does look really cool. It has double fullers that run 24 inches up, though I admit, if you look closely and you're being really picky, you can kind of see that the fullers terminate in slightly different spots. Both the double fullers and on the opposite sides, they're just a little different. For $350, again, not gonna bitch and moan too much about it. I'm not expecting perfection at that price, but I do like to see when fullers terminate in the exact same spot on a blade. I also find it interesting from a dynamic perspective, as I give the sword like a whack, and you see it kind of rattle around. This blade node is kind of right at the termination of the fullers. I don't know if that's necessarily intentional, but it's, I guess, interesting to see that's where it is. Anyway, general geometry is pretty good. I don't notice a giant secondary bevel. From the cutting plane, it slopes down, and the blade is also reasonably stiff. And sharpness-wise, you can see that I can pull my fingers on it, and I don't have little bloody, nubby stubs. So it's not terribly sharp, but it does the job when I swing hard enough. In terms of thrusting, we can, I suppose, get to the dynamic perspective of the blade, because as I talk about thrusting, the blade feels more like a cutter to me than it does a thruster. I feel less connected to the tip than I do kind of to where the end of the fullers are. That feels like where my arms are connected to the blade, and I feel like I could really connect where I want to connect there. The thrusting component, I feel, is maybe a little bit lacking. Now, that said, the tip is very, very pointy, and it does effectively slide into targets quite well. I didn't have any problems penetrating tatami mats or any of the targets that I used it on at this time, though I might have to do something a little bit more deliberate when I get around to destruction testing. That said, cutting-wise, this is, before I actually get to cutting, I should talk a little bit more about how it moves. Take a look at the weapon dynamics computer. I've provided that here. Hopefully it gives you some idea about how this sword moves and provides you with some insight. To me, it feels kind of tip heavy. The point of balance is about 6.5 inches up from the guard, and to me that it just gives it this kind of forward moving tip heavy sensation. But the longer guard in my hand, it doesn't feel cumbersome, hard to move around. It's reasonably comfortable, but I do feel heft. I do feel like I need to use two hands. One hand, this sword doesn't want to move for me. Two hands, it kind of comes alive, and I feel like I can put the pointy end in the other guy, as I am so fond of saying. The chopping motion feels comfortable. I didn't feel like recovery was bad for something as big as this. It's almost 4 pounds at 3 pounds, 10.5 ounces. This is a pretty stout blade. And I feel like I can connect and recover reasonably well at a reasonable pace. So from that side of things, I definitely don't think it's bad dynamically, but I suppose you can be the judge down below. That said, it's not a quick response sword. This is two-handed. Wouldn't want to use it with a shield. Hopefully you're wearing some hefty armor if you're swinging something like this around. And it does have the sensation that I could really cause some impact with it if I needed to do some percussive maintenance on somebody. So all in all, dynamically, that's what I have. Cutting-wise, I alluded to it a little bit, but it's not super sharp, so in terms of targets that really showcase the sharpness, it didn't highlight there. I could connect with the point, but whether it be a pool noodle or a tatami mat, it really didn't want to sing in terms of doing that. Now, it has the profile to take a more refined edge if you either have the skill or the money to do so. And compared to the other pieces that I have, it doesn't have this ginormous, really gaudy, terribly made $20 sharpening service done to it that made a giant secondary bevel. So I think you could put a very serviceable, better edge on it given the geometry it has, but it doesn't currently have the sharpness that makes it just swing through tatami, which I think it totally could do based on how heavy it is and how connected I feel to the cutting plane. When I swing hard enough, it cuts through tatami. That's not necessarily a mark of a good sword. Cutting through tatami is not the challenge. The challenge is doing it with clean, even angles and controlled, where you move through the target and you can stop and you're still in control of your blade. You're still pointing it at the target's face and being offensive at the same time without creating openings. And that's where a challenge comes in, not just moving through, but I feel like based on the current sharpness, I really have to muscle through it. Now, other things I've done, the sword cut through other targets really, really well. It's been a blast to use, and in terms of cutting, it's fun. It just needs a more keen edge to do some of these, simple cuts with pool noodles, water bottles, and tatami. Now, if you're smacking it into armored targets, I don't doubt that you could lay someone on their feet with something that feels the way this does. I feel like I could really connect. And I also don't feel a ton of force as I do connect and stop in a tatami mat. I don't feel it shake my hands. The transfer force, or however this is vibrating, feels actually pretty good on my hands, especially as I drive forward with my right hand, holding it kind of right on this swept edge here. It's comfortable in the cut, but I feel like I have to muscle it. Now is the part where I try to tell you, do I think it's worth it or not? And the short answer to that is yes, absolutely I do. And the reason for that more specifically is it's tough for me as a buyer, as a collector, as a practitioner to think of something that is built as well as this one is, that's held up to some of the things that I've done to it, and is as inexpensive. At $350, this represents a very good deal, and frankly, kind of a step up in that kind of lower mid-range price of swords. The crossguard has a smaller gap. The edges are rounded to not bite into your fingers, even though it does create some discomfort here. Stylistically, it looks good. The grip is held up well and not come undone. The sword is made out of durable steel and held up well. It doesn't have a giant, gaudy, stupid $25 edge sharpening on it. It has a refined edge that isn't sharp enough to really do what I want it to do, but at least has the profile to take a keen one without completely creating a giant ugly secondary bevel, and is just long and cool looking. The build quality is good, the aesthetics are nice, and it also feels dynamically more purpose built. This feels like it's supposed to be a sword that's at least intended to be used with two hands primarily, and I feel connected to the cut. I feels like that's what I'm supposed to do with it. And when I think of other manufacturers, a lot of those things tend to get missed. I'm referencing some of the other swords that I've reviewed here, and either dynamically they don't feel like they really match what they're supposed to be doing, or the build quality is off. They have big secondary bevels, large gaps, grips that don't look as good, refined overall aesthetics or attentions to detail that are missing out. And this one I think just represents overall a really good step up. This is a great looking sword for $350, and I don't know of a better deal for a new sword out there in terms of this type of build quality. Admittedly, my experience with European swords is smaller than in the Japanese realm of things, but I do think I've had a couple of them, and I think this is a pretty solid build quality. Now, where I can't answer the question for you is if you're looking for a particular type of European sword because you study a martial art and you're looking for a piece that represents something from a period in history to help you either connect with that from a collector standpoint or practice from a martial standpoint. I don't know if this hits that mark, and if you do, throw it in the commentary down below. But from a general build quality, I like European swords and this one looks cool. type collector or buyer or practitioner or backyard fund haver, I think this one is a pretty solid deal. And that's really all I got for you. Hopefully this review has been helpful. I look forward to continuing it with future destructive testing. If you have any supplemental information, things you think I missed, or additional information, throw it in the commentary down below. I'd really appreciate it, as would other people that find my review lacking. And that is all I have for you. So, as always, cheers and thanks for watching.